I've spent 3 decades analyzing how trade policy intersects with global strategy, watching how economic decisions create ripple effects that extend far beyond their intended targets. What I observed during Trump's tariff implementation revealed something important about the gap between campaign promises and complex economic realities. I'm talking about the moment when Trump's sweeping tariff announcements began affecting American manufacturers who depended on imported components, creating unintended consequences that policy planners hadn't fully anticipated. Trump's steel tariffs provide a clear case study. The policy was designed to protect American steel producers and strengthen domestic manufacturing capacity, legitimate objectives that deserve serious consideration. But Trump's implementation created immediate challenges for American companies that use steel as input for their own production. I tracked how automotive manufacturers, construction companies, and appliance makers suddenly faced higher input costs that they had to absorb or pass along to consumers. These weren't abstract economic theories. These were real businesses employing hundreds of thousands of Americans who found their competitive position weakened rather than strengthened. General Motors announced plant closures partially attributed to higher steel costs. Ford delayed expansion projects due to increased material expenses. Caterpillar, the heavy machinery manufacturer, saw profit margins compressed by tariff-related cost increases that they couldn't immediately pass through to customers who had existing contracts. The timing created additional complications. Trump announced these tariffs without the gradual phase-in periods that allow industries to adjust their supply chains and sourcing strategies. When Trump changed the cost structure of entire industries overnight, the disruption affected everyone in those value chains. What struck me was how Trump's approach affected precisely the manufacturing workers that the policy was supposed to help. Auto plants in Ohio faced higher steel costs. Machinery manufacturers in Wisconsin had to renegotiate contracts. Construction projects across the Midwest saw material costs increase significantly. The nail manufacturing industry provides a specific example that illustrates broader patterns. Mid-Continent Nail Corporation, America's largest nail producer, employed 500 workers in Missouri. When Trump's steel tariffs increased their raw material costs while Chinese competitors continued accessing cheaper inputs, the company laid off workers and reduced production despite being exactly the type of manufacturer Trump's policy intended to protect. The agricultural sector experienced similar dynamics from a different angle. When trading partners responded with retaliatory tariffs targeting American farm exports, farming communities that had supported Trump found themselves losing market access they had spent decades building. I analyzed the impact on soybean farmers who watched Chinese purchases shift to Brazilian suppliers almost immediately after Trump's trade war escalated. These weren't temporary market adjustments. These were relationship changes that would persist long after Trump's tariff policies changed, because agricultural trade depends on reliable long-term partnerships. The numbers tell a stark story. American soybean exports to China dropped from $14 billion in 2017 to $3 billion in 2018. Brazilian farmers expanded production to fill the gap, establishing relationships and infrastructure that wouldn't disappear when American trade policy eventually changed. The dairy industry faced similar challenges when Mexico and Canada, our NAFTA partners, imposed retaliatory measures that specifically targeted American agricultural exports. Wisconsin cheese producers and dairy farmers found themselves competing against subsidized alternatives in markets they had previously dominated. Corn growers in Iowa saw exports to Mexico decline as buyers switched to Argentine suppliers. Pork producers in North Carolina lost market share in key export destinations. These losses affected rural communities that had overwhelmingly supported the administration, creating political complications alongside economic ones. From a strategic perspective, the most concerning aspect was how Trump's trade tensions affected relationships with allies who were simultaneously being asked for cooperation on security issues. When Trump was imposing steel tariffs on European allies while requesting their support for Iran sanctions, the mixed signals complicated both objectives. The European Union's response, was carefully calibrated to create maximum political impact with minimum economic disruption to their own industries. They targeted bourbon from Kentucky, motorcycles from Wisconsin, and agricultural products from politically important states. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic retaliation designed to create domestic pressure for Trump to change his policies. The timing with China presented particular challenges. Trade negotiations require sustained diplomatic engagement and careful relationship management. When Trump's trade policy became unpredictable, it made serious negotiation more difficult because Chinese planners couldn't assess which commitments might change based on domestic political pressures. I observed how China adapted its strategy to take advantage of Trump's trade uncertainty. Beijing accelerated its Belt and Road investments, positioning itself as a more reliable long-term partner for countries concerned about Trump's trade policy volatility. This wasn't just reactive, it was opportunistic strategic planning. The semiconductor industry illustrates how complex global supply chains resist simple policy solutions. American tech companies depend on specialized components manufactured across multiple countries. When trade tensions disrupt these networks, the result isn't reshoring of production. It's often relocation of entire operations to regions with more predictable trade relationships. Apple's manufacturing strategy required significant adjustment when component costs increased and supply reliability became uncertain. The company didn't bring production back to America. They diversified supply chains across Vietnam, India, and other countries that could provide both cost-effectiveness and stability. Google's hardware production faced similar challenges. The Pixel phone manufacturing, initially concentrated in China, required rapid redistribution across multiple countries when trade tensions created supply chain vulnerabilities. These adjustments cost hundreds of millions in retooling and relationship building. Intel's fabrication network, one of America's most advanced manufacturing operations, found itself navigating complex decisions about where to locate new facilities when trade relationships with key suppliers became uncertain. The energy sector provides another example of unintended complexity. American natural gas exports had been growing rapidly, providing both economic benefits and strategic leverage with allies who wanted alternatives to Russian energy. Trade tensions with traditional partners complicated these relationships precisely when energy security was becoming more important. European countries that wanted to reduce Russian gas dependence found themselves navigating trade disputes with America simultaneously. This created opportunities for Russia to maintain market share that might otherwise have shifted to American suppliers. The consumer impact became visible in retail prices across multiple sectors. Trump's washing machine tariffs increased appliance costs by an average of $86 per unit. Lumber tariffs added thousands to housing construction costs. Electronics prices rose as component costs increased throughout the supply chain. The Federal Reserve estimated that Trump's tariffs functioned as a tax increase on American consumers, with lower-income families disproportionately affected because they spend larger portions of their income on goods subject to tariffs. The manufacturing data tells a story that's more nuanced than simple success or failure. Some American industries did benefit from protection, particularly primary steel production. United States Steel Corporation reopened facilities and hired additional workers. Aluminum producers expanded capacity and increased employment. But these gains came at the cost of downstream industries that employ more workers and often operate with thinner profit margins. The Economic Policy Institute calculated that tariff policies created roughly 200,000 jobs in protected industries, while eliminating nearly 300,000 jobs in industries that depend on those inputs. What made this particularly unfortunate was how much potential existed for more targeted approaches. Trade policy experts had identified specific practices by China and other countries that genuinely disadvantaged American companies. Addressing those specific issues might have achieved better results with fewer unintended consequences. The intellectual property theft concerns were legitimate and serious. Chinese companies had indeed been engaging in forced technology transfer and corporate espionage that cost American businesses billions annually. The Committee on Foreign Investment Analysis documented systematic patterns of technology acquisition through mandatory joint ventures and licensing requirements. But addressing intellectual property theft requires different tools than addressing trade imbalances. Patent enforcement, investment restrictions, and technology transfer regulations can target specific problems without disrupting entire supply chains that support American manufacturing. The missed opportunity was enormous. American innovation advantages in technology, finance, and advanced manufacturing could have been leveraged more effectively through partnerships with allies who shared concerns about Chinese industrial practices. Germany, Japan, and South Korea all had similar concerns about forced technology transfer and state-subsidized Chinese competition. Coordinated responses might have created more pressure for Chinese policy changes while avoiding bilateral trade war dynamics that allowed China to play American allies against each other. The World Trade Organization framework, despite its limitations, provided mechanisms for addressing unfair trade practices through multilateral pressure. Working within existing international structures might have achieved sustainable results rather than temporary bilateral agreements that could be reversed by future administrations. The agricultural agreements that emerged later showed what more targeted approaches could achieve. When negotiators focused on specific market access issues rather than broad tariff battles, they made genuine progress on problems that had persisted for decades. China agreed to increase purchases of American agricultural products and reduce some barriers to financial services. These agreements addressed specific competitive disadvantages without requiring broad disruption of established trade relationships. But by that point, farming communities had already experienced several years of market disruption and relationship damage. Brazilian soybean producers had established market positions and infrastructure investments that would be difficult for American farmers to reclaim even after trade tensions subsided. The lesson isn't that trade policy should avoid protecting American interests, but that complex economic relationships require sophisticated policy tools rather than blunt instruments that create unintended consequences. Modern supply chains reflect decades of economic evolution and technological development. Disrupting these networks without careful planning affects American workers and businesses as much as foreign competitors. The pharmaceutical industry provides another illustration of supply chain complexity. American drug companies depend on active pharmaceutical ingredients manufactured globally. Trade tensions that disrupt these supply chains can affect medicine availability and healthcare costs rather than strengthening domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing. Moving forward, effective trade policy requires understanding how economic integration affects American strategic interests. Some aspects of globalization genuinely disadvantage American